Since at least the late 18th century, there's been a growing anxiety about the relationship between technology and language. My hope for this paper is that focusing on the changes that technology is, or may be, bringing about in our relation to language will therefore also provide important perspectives on other aspects of a contemporary crisis of human beings' relation to their technology, to their politics, and their ability to speak truthfully of God. And the last two in particular I want to see in this paper as closely connected, and in the paper I'm slightly anticipating the response of Tim Noble, which I read very quickly last night and have slightly incorporated a response to it into the paper, which may be cheating, but not too much, I hope. Schiller's essay on the aesthetic education of mankind is an early and still exceptionally clear statement of the sense of how the increasing division of labour in modern society means that human beings are becoming compartmentalised and fragmented. One person is nothing but a brain, another nothing but a hand, a complaint that will be echoed a century later by Nietzsche's Zarathustra, when he looked around and saw nothing but fragments of human beings, chances and riddles, but no real human beings. Schiller's remedy was that we needed to look back to an age when things were otherwise, when the warrior could also be a poet, a philosopher, and a statesman. And for Schiller, this meant returning to Greece so as to learn what it meant to be a rounded human being. Schiller's classicism, of course, belongs in the history of what has been called the tyranny of Greece over the German mind. But in Schiller's case, it's important to note that the primary mode of this return to Greece was poetry. In this regard, Schiller's programme will be taken up by many who didn't feel the pull of Hellenic antiquity, romantics more oriented towards the Middle Ages, or in England to the humble lives of the Lakeland poor, or to exotic Oriental scenarios, could also share in this exaltation of poetry as the primary means of restoring the lost wholeness of human life. Other arts would also have their champions, and both painting and music were sometimes promoted as offering a version of salvation to human beings in their hour of need. But tellingly, this was often argued in terms precisely of the poetic character of the art in question. But if the poetic is in this way central to the crisis of modernity, then this makes language itself also central to this crisis. An important further element is the question as to the relationship between language and mathematics, and which is best suited to tell us the truth about ourselves. To the extent that human beings can indeed be quantified according to the procedures of science and applied science as the objects of biological, physiological, psychological, or social science, mathematics would seem to have as clear a preeminence in the study of the human as it does in any area of hard science. And if some applications are obviously questionable, others seem to have become well embedded in what is now widely regarded as normal and unquestionable science. We might also note a penumbra of applications where life processes are subject to metrics that may not always be rooted in robustly exact mathematics, but that are sufficiently trusted to eliminate or reduce the vagaries of subjective or corrupt manipulation. Such are, for example, the metrics that have now become normal in appointment procedures in universities or in the assessment of academic research. Yet few, including few mathematicians, would argue that mathematics can answer every question, and questions remain around the limits appropriate to the application of these models. If social statistics are an essential part of governmental functioning, the example of Malthus reminds us that these need to be handled with exceptional care. This is especially the case where, despite the drive towards quantification, there are in fact few clear rules for determining which elements of the original phenomenon in question are most appropriate for treating in this way. In other words, the application of a mathematical procedure presupposes what remains a qualitative human judgment. The problem is that the application of the procedure obscures its dependence on such judgments, and consequently it devalues the need to develop the skills and attitudes they require. One example here would be the previously mentioned examples of appointments and research assessment. One area where the tension between what can and what can't be quantified is especially profound, though not always openly recognized as such, is in relation to the kinds of communication favored by electronic media. For example, we can see how these media are bringing about changes in the ways in which we actually produce text, with regard to such requirements as the elimination of formulae such as see page 20 above, in favour of reference to sections that are standard in electronic and print versions, or the use of provision of keywords for online searching, and changes in forms of indexing. Now, these are neither good nor bad in themselves, but they seem to be part of an ever more formulaic approach to the production of academic text that standardizes the structuring of articles or books, or as we increasingly call them, outputs, in ways geared towards their being quantitatively assessed by governmentally funded research panels. Of course, neither is this all bad. Working with some students who have difficulties in constructing a halfway coherent text, it's obvious that a certain objectification can be a helpful tool in increasing students' performance, and increasing it not just in the quantitative sense, but also in terms of their understanding of what's going on and the self-esteem they derive from being able to do a good job. Musicians have to do their scales. A more questionable manifestation of the same tendency are the Facebook entries or text messages that forego efforts in the direction of nuanced sentence structure in favour of globally standardized formulae, OMG, matched with relentlessly monotonous selfies and dancing cats. Words like objectification and reification seem to fit some of the tendencies of this new communication, and we can easily list other examples and easily see negative outcomes, such as attitudes to sexuality, the capacity for attention to others in their concrete being there, and an argument already formulated by Hannah Arendt for politics. As Arendt wrote in The Human Condition, speech is what makes man a political being, and science, she's argued, whatever its other virtues, operates in a world of mathematical symbols in which speech has lost its power. In this connection, we might ponder whether the current popularity of referenda as a means of deciding complex political issues is not also a symptom of the loss of speech-based politics in favour of, in this case, a very crude kind of mathematics, which probably also connects to the phenomenon of post-truth politics. Given the role that Descartes played in establishing the role of mathematics as key to knowledge of human beings and their world, it's easy to see that when the crisis of modernity is seen in these terms and identified with the kind of phenomena I've just listed, Descartes also becomes identified as public enemy number one. It's therefore no surprise that the theoretical revolt against the diminution of the living human being to the thinking Cartesian ego will often accompany or even underpin the kind of complaint about technology I've just set out. In this perspective, La Maîtrise, Machine Man, Philosophical Brains in Vats, and Ray Kurzweil's notion of the singularity event in which human beings merge with their machines are predictable, if perverse, expressions of a view in which meaning, value, and lived sensibility are not allowed to count as offering genuine knowledge about who we are. However, this is a point that came up in the previous session, none of this is something being inflicted on us by some kind of cosmic assault on humanity from outer space. As Romano Guardini wrote in his reflections nearly 100 years ago on technology and humanity, our age is not just an external path we tread, it is ourselves. Technology is not an alien invasion, but emerges from human history. We recall that Walter Ong's account of the technologization of the word focused primarily not on computers, but on the impact of printing, and that indeed not only printing, but, for example, the superseding of the scroll by the book and of papyrus and vellum by paper are already major events in the technologizing of language. What we're dealing with, in other words, is a process that long predates the advent of email and the iPhone, and as Ong already pointed out, traditional features of academic writing such as contents pages, tables and indexes are themselves the product of the age of print. We must also become over-eager in identifying what's wrong or potentially wrong with the new communication technologies. Each of the negative features ascribed to these technologies is debatable, and optimists are quick to highlight the multiple positive impacts these can have. The debate is wide open. As Hegel reminded us, historical events can only ever be fully understood when they're over, and none of us is in a position to reach a final verdict. But precisely because we are still underway, and are not only capable of, but arguably also obliged to articulate and take account of our own experience of the manifold and conflicting currents in play around us, we have to work towards some kinds of judgments. When Gardini wrote that our age is not just the external path we tread, it is ourselves, he indicated that technology is not something out there that we have to deal with, whether as obstruction or opportunity. It is, or it has developed to the point at which how we are with our technology defines who we are. Recognition of this situation has several consequences. Firstly, it puts a question mark against any view of the human being based on a supposed timeless or non-historical nature or essence. Technology has in our time penetrated so deeply into the nature of human being that just about everything about us is in some degree affected by it. But secondly, it also reveals something that really has been true about human beings all along, namely that we do not exist apart from our world and our interaction with it. To take just one example, though this is controversial, I believe, it's not the case that there was in the beginning a fully formed human being who then learned the skill of tool making and tool use. Rather, the process of learning tool making and tool using itself contributed to the forming of the being we now know as the human being. To reckon with technology is therefore in the end to be reckoning with ourselves about who we are and what we are capable of. All this has fairly clear implications for our relation to language. Even more than in the case of the tool, language belongs at the very centre of our sense of self, our sense of humanity. Aristotle famously defined the human as the living being having logos, which, as Heidegger pointed out, is something quite different from the traditional translation, man is the rational animal, although language has been read, as it were, in the perspective of that translation. Idealism viewed language as a purely spiritual, non-material attribute of human being, a vehicle for non-material thoughts. And interestingly, until quite recently, even scientists in the field of evolutionary biology strongly culturally resisted the idea that non-human animals might have any capacity for language. Just as in the case of the tool, and to a higher degree, it follows that language is not something external we can pick up or put down according to the requirements of the situation. Heidegger thus objected to Wilhelm von Humboldt's view, as he possibly wrongly saw it, that language is a kind of instrument, serving to establish and represent humanity's world and worldview. Rather than an instrument in the service as what we take to be a determinate cosmic entity named man, it is rather the case that, as Heidegger puts it elsewhere, human beings belong to language. In attending to language, it's therefore less a matter of trying to find out what you or I are intending to say, but to take heed of what language itself is saying. Die Sprache spricht. Although these kinds of formulations may be taken as typical of Heidegger's later writings, they're implicit in the basic approach of being and time, where Heidegger repeatedly uses everyday phrases, such as man sagt, or plays on etymologies of key terms such as phenomenology itself or aletheia to progress his argument. It's therefore unsurprising when Heidegger also sees language as especially revelatory of the character of our age of technology, as it reduces not only language but all human relations and activities to instruments of interplanetary information. That's a quote, adding that, again I quote, metalanguage and Sputnik, metalinguistics and rocket science are one and the same. That was, of course, written around about 1960. Signs of this technicization are everywhere. According to Heidegger, quote, a symptom, at first sight quite superficial, of the growing power of one-track thinking is the increase everywhere of designations consisting of abbreviations of words or combinations of their initials. Presumably no one here has ever given serious thought to what has already come to pass when, instead of university, you simply say uni. Uni, that is like movie. True, the moving picture theatre continues to be different from the Academy of the Sciences. One senses an unspoken footnote for now. Still, the designation uni is not accidental, let alone harmless. It may even be in order for you to go in and out of the uni and study Natsky. That's not actually an exact translation, but in Cambridge, as Janet knows, people who study natural science are known as Natskis. And I think the sort of Russian effect of that is not actually accidental. There was a very strong kind of Soviet orientation in Cambridge science in the post-war period. But the question remains, this is still Heidegger talking, the question remains what kind of order is heralded here in the spreading of this kind of language. Perhaps it's an order into which we are drawn and to which we are abandoned by that which withdraws from us. This last sentence points to a broad range of themes that come to dominate much of Heidegger's later thought, in which the present age is portrayed as an age given over to a technological worldview that is the ultimate working out of Greek metaphysics, that is marked by what he calls planetary homelessness and multi-sided international belligerence. This development is connected also with his critique of ontotheology. Here it's easy to see Heidegger as the conservative, rural pessimist, bewailing everything modern. But it's important to note that he insists that it's not technology itself that is the problem, or as he puts it, the danger, but the outlook with which we typically approach our technology, bedazzled by it, as we so typically are, he thinks. The danger is not the atom bomb, again we're in the 1950s, but the basic orientation towards ourselves and our world that has made it possible for atom bombs to be developed. Even if a universal disarmament accord were to be reached, which remains pretty unlikely, this attitude would continue to generate new dangers, such as the dangers of television-induced conformism highlighted in Brave New World, and that some see manifest in our age of emails, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. Here, a Heideggerian might argue, humanity, our being human, is as much at risk as in the brinkmanship of nuclear confrontation. These things will not kill us, but they will, the argument goes, diminish and even eliminate what makes us truly human, especially by what it does with and to our language. Or one might think that it's actually a slippage in language, a deterioration in the quality of our belonging in language to being that lies at the root of the danger diversely manifest in atom bombs and Facebook. So if the danger is actually in language, how might we address it? In a phrase of Hölderlin that Heidegger, like C.G. Jung, several times quotes, where danger is, there grows the saving power. If the danger is in the self and self-world relation of human beings constituted in language, then it must be in language that we will also find the saving power. This is indeed Heidegger's solution, especially and above all by what he sees as the poetic character of authentic language. In another favoured expression of Hölderlin, it is a matter of poetically man dwells. As should be clear, this does not mean that we should shut down the laptop and spend our evenings reading our favourite poetry. Rather, poetry points us towards another way of being in the world. From the mid-1930s onwards, Hölderlin became a constant companion on Heidegger's path of thinking. This is because he saw in Hölderlin the preeminent poet of the German language and of German identity and of our age. But why does he value the poetic and Hölderlin in particular? An important element here is to note that Heidegger's privileging of the poetic is rather different from much of what we're familiar with from recent Anglophone attempts to reinvigorate the language of theology through a return to the poetic. In the British context especially, Coleridge's theory of imagination has played an important and deserved role in providing an alternative to the supposedly value-free factual or constitutive language privileged by hard-nosed natural science. For Coleridge, we are never confronted by a world of bare facts, but with a world that we have always already imagined in one way or other. Imagination enters into the most vital and central processes of perception, and if the poet raises these to a new level, each of us echoes the divinely creative "let there be light" in each and every word we speak. But for Heidegger, it's not imagination that's decisive. Indeed, given the Kantian and German idealist provenance of the idea of imagination as conceived by Coleridge, he would certainly be likely to see in this a further, though subtle, outworking of ontotheology. More important, in Heidegger's view, is the idea of the poet as one who is called on by the gods to speak a particular word to the people, and in doing so gather them into the community of those to whom the gods' favour extends. Commenting on the opening words of Hölderlin's poem The Ister, "Now come, fire," Heidegger states that only those called to a calling can truly call come. And this calling that is called alone has a proper necessity to it. So the opening invocation may make it seem as if the poet imagines himself to be calling forth the sun, as if he had power over it, in the manner of a sovereign agent of technological dominion. But as Heidegger understands this invocation, it's rather to be understood as a declaration of readiness. Quote, "We, the ones thus calling, are ready, and are so because we are called by the coming fire itself." Far from it being the case that such poets imagine themselves able to name their world, they are rather summoned to hear, to listen, that is, to practice the belonging or listening in language to being that Heidegger elsewhere argues is definitive of our human relation to being. In these terms, the poet is not a creative I bringing forth new words in the power of his productive imagination. Rather, he is a kind of translator who finds his right words by attending to the divine language, the language of thunder, mountain, and river, and rendering them as human words, interpretations open for interpretation. But as the reference to the proper necessity of poetic vocation implies, this is not just a case of inventing words that can be interpreted in an infinity of different ways. Instead, it is a word that speaks from and to a concrete conjunction of human possibilities in a particular historical moment. And it's precisely the need of this historical moment, a time marked by the disenchantment of the divine world and the delay of the divine parousia, that Heidegger sees as the defining theme of Hölderlin's poetic work, Hölderlin's poetic calling. In other words, poetic language of this kind is precisely language that speaks for and to a situation in which human beings are seeking new foundations for community in the wake of the death of God. It's poetry that therefore keeps open the possibility of a saving power, a new God to come, even in the time of God's eclipse and absence. There is much to question here. As ever in the later Heidegger, there are possible political implications that we're likely to find uncomfortable. We might also recall Schiller's own lament for the gods of Greece, that what lives undyingly in song, in life must pass away. I leave these questions for discussion, but I do wish to touch on one further feature of Heidegger's argument, namely his insistence on speech, the spoken word, as the primary mode in which language is manifest. It's in this connection that we can interpret the perhaps surprising fact that Heidegger at one point gave a broadcast reading on radio of a selection of Hölderlin poems. Now, in the light of what he says elsewhere about technology, one might wonder that he agreed to use such a technological medium with which to share the words of his favourite poet. Now, radio seems pretty safe to us, but for his generation, read Gabriel Marcel on radio. This is kind of a real threat to the existence of human community. So whatever reservations Heidegger himself may have had about the medium, he clearly believed that it was nevertheless a means by which to give speech to the poetic word, a way of helping people to hear Hölderlin. In this connection, it's significant that in the introductory words he asked, "What does the poet say to us?" To which his answer was, "He says, the holy." To be in language otherwise than in the mode of technology then, even when one was speaking through the technological medium of radio, is to be giving voice to language and giving voice to the holy. In this regard, it's therefore rather consistent with some of the basic differences between them that amongst the phenomena that Derrida lists at the start of De la Grammatologie as marking the conquest of language by writing are cinematography, cybernetics, and genetics. That is precisely the same phenomena in which Heidegger discerns the danger of a technicization of language. Yet in his career, Derrida too will later sound a notion of caution with regard to what he calls the artifactuality of contemporary communication, a term deliberately combining artificiality and virtuality, and that he sees as particularly sinister in the context of political life. Recent examples are plentiful. Again, we might recall Arendt's warning about the fundamental difference between science and politics as regards language. In these terms, the recovery of the living voice, of the voice that is spoken and owned by the speaker, for which the speaker takes responsibility in his or her own body, the body that resonates with the effort of their speaking, is also at the centre of the political crisis of our time. Clearly, we cannot reproduce the face-to-face of Athenian democracy, and as in the case of Heidegger's poetry broadcasts, it's therefore not a matter of abandoning the age of technology, but of finding a comportment that preserves what is essential as we seek to orientate ourselves within it. But if Heidegger is right, this is also connected with the question of calling, vocation, that is, of speaking in a manner otherwise than the arbitrary assertion of individual or sectional interests, speaking under the constraints of what, in the case of the poet, Heidegger calls necessity. Authentic politics cannot be managed. This was already the false promise of the teachers of rhetoric in the ancient world, reminds us that the task of philosophy in sifting the false and the true is nothing new, and if we can extend Ong's words to the emergence of the sophists and teachers of rhetoric, their practice too already evidences a certain technologizing of the word, even in, with, and under a situation in which the word was still, for the most part, spoken. Here, then, we might see the philosophical questioning of the functioning of contemporary media as returning us to the very sources of philosophy itself, a perennial vocation perhaps challenged into life by new tasks. And of course, in the context of our colloquium, this is not only a question of relearning truthful political speech. The call to speak truthfully of ourselves and of our intimate and political life world cannot, if everything Heidegger says is correct, be separated from the call to speak truthfully of the holy and the gods, but we might prefer to call simply, if provisionally, God. Hearing that call, understanding that call, submitting to its necessity and promise, is therefore not separate or separable from the quest for a humane politics, but is integral to it.